Hello, we're here at McGill University for the CETA conference. I'm here with Professor Krina Viju. She's a professor at the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at Carleton University. Thank you for being with us, Krina.
Thank you for chatting with me.
You presented today on regulatory cooperation and the CETA. Can you explain for us what was agreed to in the CETA?
Today I was talking about regulatory cooperation in terms of goods, which internationally under WTO, the international agreement, they are divided into sub-agreements, which are the sanitary and phytosanitary agreement and the technical barriers to trade agreement. So sanitary and phytosanitary agreement or rules are mainly related to the health safety of products. It's mainly focused on food products. While technical barriers to trade, it's focusing on every other barriers to trade that it's not referring to health safety. So, for example, labeling, it's one example of barriers to trade. So, regulatory cooperation in CETA, it was expected that by increasing the cooperation in standards and rules between the two parties, the benefits of the agreement will be very high. Now we have to keep in mind that the European Union and Canada have different approaches in terms of regulations. The European Union is always pushing for higher standards than are provided by the WTO, and also is trying to push for its standards to be accepted by third parties through different bilateral agreements, for example, like this one. While Canada is following more of a market type of regulatory frameworks, which is a US approach, where the standards are decided by the industry, are driven by the industry. The government intervention is very minimal, so it's a totally different approach than the European Union. Now, what CETA has achieved is probably on a sectoral basis, they decided on more institutional frameworks, more institutional setups that in the future will result in more consultation, in more discussion about the different approaches in the two parties, and eventually finding a solution to meet somewhere in the middle. So, in a way, we can say, well, nothing has been achieved, but it's not true, because this is a step forward towards something that will not happen in short term, but in long term there is more setting for discussion, there is more setting for understanding each other's rules, and also to see the benefits of the other rules, and also the two parties will be forced to, now by CETA, to announce the other party about any kind of policy change that will affect the other party, so then they will know for sure where they stand and what is the position about different rules and regulations. The other aspect that has been changed in terms of regulatory cooperation, it's in terms of related to conformity assessment. So now, to give an example, if a good is sent from Canada to the EU, once it is assessed by a certain organization in Canada that entails certain qualities, then the good will be accepted in the EU, so EU will not have to assess the same good. So practically from the double assessment, it was reduced to one assessment in the country of origin, which is saving lots of costs on the producers, and also it's reducing the risk of not being accepted once the good is left from the countries.
Can you explain for us how what was agreed to in the CETA will interact or relate to current regulatory arrangements, say what Canada's agreed to in the NAFTA?
I don't think it will necessarily interfere in any way right now, because as I mentioned before, they did not give up on any of their, none of the parties have give up on any of their regulations. So the Canadian standards are still following the US standards. It's just that they have more discussion with the EU related to the standards and regulations. So right now, in this moment, I don't think that there is any interference in terms of regulations that are accepted in NAFTA and the one that are accepted in CETA, because we cannot say that any party has given up on something and taken over the others' regulations. I assume that once TTIP, the US-EU trade agreement will be finalized, we'll see how the regulatory framework is set up in that agreement. And I think in CETA, in the regulatory cooperation chapter, it is mentioned that if TTIP will result in major differences that will affect Canada, then Canada will have the right to reassess its regulatory framework.
I recall in your presentation you were speaking about a kind of balance between liberalization but on the other hand, having the ability to regulate. And can you speak to this? Does the CETA still allow you to regulate for certain measures, say environmental measures?
Yes, CETA did not interfere in any way with the government's rights to decide on their own level of health or environmental risk. And this is one thing that I also cited in my presentation from the CETA agreement, that none of the changes interfere with the domestic policy in terms of environmental policy or health policy or the health safety standards that each country decides on. And I think this is something important because the two parties are very different, especially, let's say, in certain agricultural sectors like genetically modified products. There is always, I'm not going over that, but it was always this different opinion about how much the science should be taken into account and whether the science is enough to tell us how healthy those products are. And this is one reason for which the EU in the past have imposed an import ban on genetically modified products. Now it's the import ban is substituted with a new regulatory system, but there is still from the society, there is European society is still an aversion towards GMOs. So there are different image about how much science can tell you, different views about how much science can tell you. And obviously in that situation, in that specific situation, the EU is more risk averse, does not accept these products because they consider the science is not enough and they take into account other economic aspects, consumer complaints and so on. While Canada is more liberal, it's about liberalization, it's about market opportunities and so on. So CETA did not change that. They still allow governments to decide on how much risk they have to take. But even after CETA, both parties are still bound by the WTO rules. So they cannot go against the WTO rules in terms of the level of risk that they take, for example. So, but to conclude on that, CETA necessarily by itself did not affect the possibility of governments on deciding the level of environmental risk or health risk that would be acceptable by their society.
We'll have to leave it at that, but we thank you very much, Professor Vigiu, for being with us today, and enjoy your time in Montreal.
Thank you so much, Marcel.